Good morning, Ms. Barami.
Good morning, my lord. Our first witnesses this morning are a panel from the STUC's Equality Committees. We have Tina McInding from the STUC Black Workers Committee, Julie Ferguson on behalf of the STUC Disabled Workers Committee, and Linda Somerville on behalf of the STUC.
Good morning to you both and you all.
Their witness statement numbers in order are SCI WT 0101-501, SCI WT 0334-501, and SCI WT 0918-501. Good morning. Could you please briefly start, please, with each of you briefly introducing yourselves and your roles during the pandemic, particularly in relation to your Equality Committee or organisation? If we could perhaps start with Ms Ferguson and on to Ms McInding.
Thank you. My name is Julie Ferguson. I was the chair of the Scottish Trade Union Congress Disabled Workers Committee from January 2020 to November 2021. I attended the Scottish COVID group meetings with STUC from December 2020 to September 2021.
Thank you. Ms McInding, if we could continue.
My name is Tina McInding. I work as a Band 6 staff nurse in East Lothian, part of NHS Lothian with the hospital to home. And I've been with that role for 3 years now. But prior to that and during pandemic, I've been working at Ferryfield Hospital, which is an NHS hospital, since 2005 to 2021. And I'm a steward with Unison, started in 2009. And I've been an equality officer and I'm also a black officer there. And during pandemic, I was in the STUC Black Workers Committee. That's where we were dealing with pandemic. And I'm here to give the whatever was happening that time because of the role that I hold during pandemic, though I'm no longer in the committee at the moment. Thank you.
Yes, Ms Somerville, if you could please.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Linda Somerville. I'm a Deputy General Secretary at the STUC. My role includes all of our policy, political liaison and oversight of all our equalities work. I started at the STUC in November 2020, which was sometime after the first lockdown, but during the second lockdown. Part of my role was to coordinate what we had as the COVID group, it was called, which was where the STUC, our main trade unions, our affiliates, they're often referred to, our affiliated trade unions, where they came together weekly for a while and then eventually every 2 weeks, and that moved to monthly, with Scottish Government ministers, whoever was appropriate to speak to, and they came together to raise any issues that they had at that time, and I would coordinate that group. Our Equality Committee chairs, which included Julie and Tina, were added to that group in November, and they also took part in that along with our major trade union affiliates. I also looked after all our other equalities work during COVID because it wasn't all COVID related, so our work for our committees went online. We held webinars, we still held committee meetings, we did other work in support of pieces of Parliament legislation, for example, on period poverty and period dignity, and we did other work that continued online for our equality committees during that time.
Thank you. Ms McInding, I'd like to start by clarifying a point with you at the outset in relation to your statement. It's at paragraph 15 in the final version of your statement, but in the draft of your statement, this was worded slightly differently. In the draft version, it said there was no particular intersection of characteristics which led to some black people experiencing disproportionate impacts in relation to the vaccine. In the final version, the word particular has been omitted. I'd Could you confirm that that omission was unintentional and that what you mean in that paragraph is that there's no particular intersection of characteristics that had a greater impact than any other particular set?
Okay, thank you. Anyway, in short, I can say this was an omission, which was unintentional.
Okay. And am I correct in the meaning that you had? Thank you. I'd like to start with pre-pandemic inclusion and preparedness. I wonder, were your organisations or the communities you represent included in the Scottish Government's pre-pandemic emergency planning? And if not, what were the consequences of any exclusion? Perhaps we could start with you, Ms. Makadenge.
Maybe problems that black people had, that they were facing, could have been rectified early before it went worse, if we were included in planning the pre-pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Ms. Somerville?
The STUC wasn't directly involved in any pre-pandemic planning. Some of our unions would have been, for example, the Fire Brigade Union. They can give some lengthy evidence about that, probably some of the health sector unions as well. It's not a role that we would have had directly and certainly not operationally. Mm-hmm. Our role is much more the kind of macro role to think about, what goes on with government. So if we had been involved, the case that we would have made very strongly would have been for an increase in public funding to support our public services and the workers within them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Ms. Ferguson, do you have anything to add to that?
Sorry. No, we weren't. The Disabled Workers Committee wasn't involved in pre-pandemic planning, which meant that we weren't able to contribute to disability-specific planning, and pandemics are very much about illness and hospitalisation. We have a lot to say about that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Right. So moving on to access, inclusion and government engagement during the pandemic, Ms. Somerville, how would you assess the accessibility and inclusiveness of Scottish Government engagement with the STUC and its equality structures during the pandemic?
I think it was very positive. We've written about that quite a lot. Certainly comparison to the UK government. Our experience with the UK government was not positive. And I know that our sister organisation, the TUC, similarly had really, really difficult relationships and difficult opportunities to access government, UK government. In Scotland, we had a lot of access. We already had structures in place. We have regular meetings with the First Minister and Senior Cabinet and other ministers regularly and senior officials within government. So we had relationships and we had structures in place. On top of that, as I say, prior to my starting in my role, we had set up the COVID group, and that allowed us access to the relevant ministers at the right time, and that continued throughout. So engagement was very good. I worked really closely myself and the team with Scottish Government officials. I wouldn't say that always government did what we asked them to do. They didn't always take our advice, but the engagement was positive that we had, and our experience of that was. In terms of the Equality Committee specifically, I don't know if government met with them specifically, if they'd asked for that or we'd asked for it. I think it would have been facilitated. But what we did was we made sure that our equality chairs were represented on that group. So any specific issues that their community had was brought forward to government, and we asked them to act on that. We also had some of our unions would have been interacting with government separately, for example, education unions, both schools and further in higher education. We'd have had meetings with the Minister for Education or CABSEC. We also would have had the health unions would have had their own interaction. So the larger unions particularly would have had interactions separately, but we collated the general issues and brought people together regularly with government.
Thank you. Now, Ms Makadenge and Ms Ferguson, you both joined the Scottish Government COVID group meetings months after its inception. What were the implications of the late inclusion for the Black and disabled workers? If we could start with you, Ms Ferguson.
We weren't able to contribute to the early stages of the pandemic response, and this meant that disabled people were left out, and we were very much affected by the decision, including things like shielding.
Thank you. Ms. Makadenge?
I think Julie has mentioned it, what I could have said as well, that obviously whatever the problems that we had were not addressed.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Ferguson, you raised accessibility issues with remote meetings, for example, phone-only formats. How responsive was the government for requests for adjustments?
I found them quite responsive. So I joined the STUC meetings on the 11th of November. I asked for accessible government meetings at that point. It took 3 weeks to shift to video calls, and I understood the pause because we were very much working in a different paradigm. And I found that once we moved to the video calls, people were very good about enabling subtitles, making sure the videos were on, and adjusting their lights so I could see them clearly.
Great, thank you. And the next question is for all three of you. Overall, how effective was your engagement with the Scottish Government during the pandemic? Were there examples where it led to real change, or do you feel your input was largely ignored? If we could start with you, Ms. Somerville.
No, our input wasn't ignored. I mean, there were times, as I say, that our input was probably not acted on, and I think that we can point to where some of those failures were. Some of the things that we did that were very positive, that resulted in definitely protecting workers, which is trade unions' job to do and represent them, was around negotiating with the government very early in the pandemic around getting a Fair Work First statement, a coronavirus Fair Work statement that was put in place. And significantly in that, it said that workers should not be financially penalised because for following medical advice. So that meant that people that were asked to self-isolate, or later we actually updated that statement to also include those that were to go for vaccination. It meant that therefore they were not to be loss of any pay. Now that was particularly important when you think about equalities, because we had social care workers and we had health workers, certainly predominantly women in social care, and a large proportion of black women in that situation who were out doing jobs that the rest of us were working from home. So they were the highest risk, and often the people that had less protection in terms of sick pay. So it was very important. That's one of the initiatives that we took to try and protect them, so that when they were self-isolating, that they would not be any financially penalised. As I say, and that continued for some time. Where the government didn't listen to us on that was some time later, where they said, I think it was in April 2021, the government reviewed that statement and wanted to take out the clause to say that there was no financial detriment, because they felt that that was no longer necessary for protection for those workers. And we argued very strongly, but they did not accept our argument at that case, that should continue. We also were very successful in negotiating with government a social care payment fund, which allowed, again, social care workers who were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic to access sick pay, because a lot of them were not entitled to anything other than statutory sick pay, and not for the first 3 days, obviously. So we negotiated that, and on a number of occasions we asked the government to extend that fund when it was due to run out, and they continued to do that. So it meant employers were meant to pay their workers and then claim the money back. We also know of cases where some employers in social care did not do that, and that was also raised with government. So they were claiming money and not paying workers. So we made sure that that was raised. We also lobbied successfully for funding for groups of workers that were left out by the UK government furlough scheme. For example, taxi drivers, which nobody had really thought about. They fell in this weird gap of not claiming for the self-employed and not being employed either. And also creative industry workers. Across Scotland, we've got a large sector of creative industry workers. And again, we think about equalities. There's a lot of workers that are LGBT workers in that sector. Again, a lot of women workers, a lot of young workers, and none of them were contracted and therefore had any kind of regular employment. And they also, some of them didn't have enough evidence to secure any funding through UK government furlough for those that were either for running their own business. So we secured funding for them as well, for both hardship funding and other funding that was successful. Other areas where the government didn't listen to us, for example, was in school closures. At times we were saying that they wanted to reopen schools and we were saying they shouldn't be doing that. At times we asked for regional school closures, and Julie's union, the EIS and other education unions argued for that as well, and the government wouldn't do that. So there were times that we made good arguments for things based on what our members were telling us, based on what they needed to do to protect themselves at work, and the government didn't take that forward. But I do think that there are other occasions where we can point to that were very significant, our role in being effective in protecting workers.
Thank you. Ms Makadenge, do you have anything to add to that?
Just one thing, the thing which improved later on was the PPE, especially in nursing homes. There were lack of PPE in nursing homes because they are private providers, so the government had to chip in and give PPE in the nursing homes, which was a good help.
Thank you. And Ms Ferguson, do you have anything to add?
Yes. In general, I felt listened to. My question usually had detailed answers. If I asked something that hadn't been considered, then it was taken on board, and it was I knew it would be considered fully later. An example of something that I asked about was when people were working from home, some people would need to have a very specific office set up to support them with their disability while also working from home. And it would require somebody from their employer to come in to set up the work. And this wasn't considered essential work, so I pointed that out. You can't work if you don't have the right office set up, so is this essential work or not? So.
Yeah. And on that point, Ms Ferguson, how challenging was it to obtain reasonable adjustments at home and in the workplace? Did employers do that once asked?
The experiences of individual disabled people were very different across Scotland. Some people had flexible employers who would be very supportive, whereas other people had employers that weren't interested in listening. This hasn't changed much before the pandemic, during the pandemic, after the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Ms Makadenge, you mentioned in your statement, and you touched on it in your last answer, that black workers in frontline roles had limited access to PPE and risk assessments. How did that contribute to the disproportionate risks faced by black and ethnic minority workers?
At the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of our members were calling us for advice and how they're going to manage if they don't have enough PPEs. And most of the black workers, they work in nursing homes and with agencies where the PPE was a big shortage. And they were just told to go to work and without enough PPEs. And the other thing was some of the workers, for example, who are Muslim and they keep their beards long, wearing masks was also difficult. And I also remember, because I was on the front line during COVID, and I remember my colleagues phoning me from home when I was home to say they don't have any PPEs, they end up using black bags to cover themselves. And so this was a big problem for them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Could I just add to that?
Yeah.
I mean, I think what Tina says very much brings to life what was going on. I mean, we had from the very beginning of the pandemic, before I was in post, but I know from all the documentation that this was a huge issue across social care particularly, and particularly in private social care, but not exclusively. And where you had managers that were rationing PPE, were telling people to reuse PPE. We had out-of-date PPE that was also documented, that was given out to people. So it was a huge issue. And also when thinking about PPE, we tended to think about, you know, people that were wearing masks and aprons to begin with. But we also therefore had people going into people's homes that were having to reuse PPE, move from different people's homes to other people's homes. But we also had a situation where PPE doesn't always fit. So particularly for those that were in hospital settings as well, it tends to be manufactured in a size that fits for men, and there's no other alternatives for women. So there's something to do with the structural design of some of the equipment that people actually use that is unsuitable because it's not thought about from an equalities point of view.
Thank you. Ms Ferguson, another question for you. In your witness statement, you describe the challenges face masks posed for deaf and visually impaired people. Were there any effective mitigations or accommodations introduced in workplaces?
For most of us who were deaf or deafblind, we tended to just shift to using pen and paper to help us understand what other people were saying, or possibly using a mobile phone and typing on the mobile phone to communicate. Some people would choose to pull down their face mask so that we could lip read and then pop it back up immediately after they were finished speaking. There were face shields and clear face masks available, but they were very rare. I did occasionally see them, but they were, like I say, very rare. But face shields, they have the problem of airflow because they're not blocking the movement of potential COVID virus particles from the person wearing the face shield. And the face mask would condense over the clear part, so you still couldn't lip read.
Okay, thank you. And again, Ms Ferguson, how did, you perhaps touched on this in one of your previous answers, but how did employers' understanding and implementation of their duties under the Equality Act 2010 change during the pandemic? I know you said there were issues and there are still issues, but are there examples of good practice or poor practice that you can highlight for us?
I can, yes. So an example of a poor practice would be when everybody returned back to work, when restrictions were lifted, it was allowed that COVID positive people could continue to work while being positive in the workplace. And this was an issue for people who were vulnerable, who had been shielding but had been told to stop shielding. And while risk assessment should be completed, you didn't always have the full set of risk assessments, or the risk assessments would be ignored. So that was definitely something that was very distressing for that group of disabled people. The thing is, we tend to quite often hear about poor practice as union rep because people don't come to us when things are going well, they come to us when things are going badly. But from a personal perspective, some of the good practice that I experienced was that at the time I was working 3 long days, I was working part-time, and I asked if I could shift the 3 long days to 5 short days, and that was approved so that I could spread out the time that I spent on my computer supporting my pupils at school. Department meetings made the teams, the colleagues be more flexible for childcare. But also, with the increased use of video meetings, it was a big benefit for a lot of disabled people because it meant that we were more included, not simply deaf people, but disabled people who might be more restricted to being at home. And also the massive increase in being able to work from home, because before the pandemic, disabled people would ask, can we work from home? My job can be done from home. And this would be refused because they had to be in the office. Whereas during the pandemic, everybody was told, if you can, work from home. And all of a sudden, we could work from home. And this was much more inclusive for disabled people who found the workplace challenging. So it's quite disappointing that people are asking people to go back into the workplace rather than continuing to be able to have the work from home that we had so much good access to.
Thank you. Ms. Somerville, can you provide examples of unions using government guidance to push for better safety protections?
Yes, there's numerous examples. At one point, I think we had around 32 parts of 32 different types of sectoral guidance that we were working through. From our point of view, I suppose one of the concerns about the guidance was, and I understand why it happened, because it had to happen very quickly, but we were asked to react to it very quickly. And as a small organisation, we just didn't have the capacity to do that sometimes. We tried, but that was quite difficult. Often guidance was being updated or turned around within 24 hours. Depending on the change in circumstances. So, you know, one of the things is about actually giving more capacity and resource to organisations. If you want their input, you need to make sure they're resourced to do so. So we found it quite challenging, but wherever possible, we would try and get the key unions involved in that, whatever that sector was, together and to input to the guidance. And there's, you know, a list of it's a kind of point in time which has in it all of the different guidance and all the unions that were involved in different parts of that. It could range from, there was a kind of offices guidance that was looked at, and we made that quite specific for call centres because there was a lot of issues in call centres. One of the main issues to begin with was what was essential and non-essential work, and some employers were quite scandalous in their disregard of people's health to begin with, their workers' health, and were insisting people doing sales jobs and other jobs that were simply not essential were still coming into the office in very early days. So bringing in sectoral guidance and also at different stages in the pandemic for call centres was really important. People were being crammed into offices so there was no social distancing. So that type of guidance was actively used by the unions in those areas to challenge employers where they knew that it wasn't correct. We also had guidance that was very specific to construction, and construction was another area where there was a lot of ambiguity, or certainly sometimes not ambiguity, but actually bad practice by employers who were trying to say that their construction sites needed to stay open, and because it was outdoors it was okay. But at that point none of this building was essential, and we had to sometimes get people taken off site, or their unions did, to say that that didn't happen. And again, the guidance could help to reinforce that. Manufacturing, similarly, there was food outbreaks in a number of manufacturing plants, on food production as well, plants. So some of that was deemed to be essential, but again, you know, sometimes the guidance wasn't being enforced. There was a lack of people to help enforce the guidance. Really, your union reps became the people to enforce that guidance. So they needed access to it, and they needed access to it quickly. They needed to be involved and input into updating that guidance. Retail, another area that was still open during the pandemic, also had specific guidance, and the unions there used that very actively, again on social distancing and to help protect staff who were at work when people weren't using face masks, and sadly the abuse that was then coming to people who were shop workers but were then being abused by members of the public sometimes because they were being asked to wear face masks. So there was guidance that was used there. Education, heavily regulated as well in terms of guidance, and schools and colleges as well. We had campuses that were universities that were trying to reopen campuses when people were still being told to work at home, and actually that learning could still have been done online or indeed blended learning. But a lot of universities were very keen to reopen and get their staff back at work because they wanted students on the ground because it brought in income for them. So again, complete disregard for what was really in the best public health measures. But that guidance would have been utilised to make those arguments to the employer to protect people and ensure that workers were both, that every situation was risk assessed and that the best of guidance was actually followed. That included things like PPE, ventilation and other things that were necessary for different sectors.
Thank you. I want to move on to look at the disproportionate impacts in a bit more detail. And across your witness statements, there's a clear pattern of disproportionate impacts on the groups that you represent. Could each of you elaborate on the most significant equality and human rights challenges faced by the workers you represent, and how structural inequalities, zero-hour contracts and sick pay for self-isolating amplified the challenges faced? Perhaps we could start with you, Ms. Makadenge, then move on to Ms. Ferguson and then Ms. Somerville.
Okay. With black workers, the problem was most of them they have zero contracts. For example, agencies, as I've said, most black people, they work with agencies or a bank, staff bank, in the NHS. And then when they are off sick, they don't get paid. So the same thing during COVID, if they had contracted COVID, they were supposed to isolate, and knowing that if they isolate, there's not going to be money coming, and they were worried how they are going to feed their families. And as a result, some might have just come when they were not well with COVID, and obviously spreading it because of the zero contract hours. Yeah.
Okay, Ms. Ferguson.
There's a certain overlap for disabled people with black workers. It's particularly if you've got black disabled workers. To some of Tina's answer will instruct part of mine. But many disabled people will work part-time or on 0 hours contract. And from my sector in particular, I'm a teacher. We have supply teachers that will come in to do a day's work, and then they'll go away, come back another next week and do a couple of days' work. And during the pandemic, they didn't have a job, but they weren't technically employed in a way that would allow them to be furloughed or receive other support. If you were part-time, part of the problem with disability is that you're more likely to be living in poverty or close to poverty. And if you're part-time and then you were furloughed, you would be on 80% of a salary that might not have been enough in the first place. So you would then be moved into poverty through being furloughed. Shielding people were told that they had to work from home, but if it wasn't possible for them to work from home, they might be furloughed, which would again have the poverty impact potentially. Or even be dismissed from the job. And statutory sick pay, I'm aware that there were many cases where if you took too long to recover, particularly if you developed long COVID after an infection, the statutory sick pay would run out, which would mean that the person wouldn't receive any sick pay unless the employer chose to continue paying it, which not all employers did.
Thank you. Ms. Somerville.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of things when we think about the kind of structural inequalities that there are. I mean, there was the basic job of government, its first job really is to protect citizens. And we saw the UK government fail to do that on a whole number of occasions by reopening the economy at times when there was in a rush to do so and encouraging people to, go out and eat out and all of the rest of it. They completely failed across the UK government. There was a real sense as well in Scotland that sometimes the messaging from Scottish government was being undermined by the UK government. We also had situations sometimes where there was complex, where you had UK government employees that were based in Scotland that didn't know what form of guidance that they were meant to follow. So there was an issue there as well about working across the devolved nations with the four nations approach that didn't always work. In terms of the employers have a responsibility for health and safety at work. And it's one of the most basic things and one of the oldest acts in terms of employment legislation that we have. And yet there's no one on the ground to enforce that. The Health and Safety Executive were not skilled or certainly not tooled up to do that. They did not have the resources to do that. So we had a lack of protection in workplaces. And for those that already suffered from structural inequalities, and that could well be people who are in lower paid work, which tends to be women, tends to be disabled workers, tends to be younger workers, tends to be black workers. If we also had a situation where people who are in higher risk jobs, which if you correlate them, the higher risk jobs tend to be the lower paid jobs because they were less able to seek protection and they were deemed to be much more in an essential service, whether that was in health or in social care or in retail. Hospitality closed down, which meant that young people therefore were much more likely to be dismissed rather than receive furlough, and they were much more likely to be working on 0-hour contracts. So those jobs kind of disappeared unhindered and left them with nothing a lot of the time. I think we also had a situation where LGBT workers as well, which haven't been mentioned so much as a group, they had a significant increase in mental health issues during that time. People were cut off from often their own supportive networks that they had. And also the right to privacy was sometimes made very, very difficult to dignity and privacy, because they were having to work in a situation that was at home when maybe they weren't out in the work at home, but they might have been in the workplace or in a different part of society. But the inequalities that we have around people's both health and structural inequalities around health inequalities are very well known to Scottish Government. They're very well documented before the pandemic. Similarly with housing, where you have higher concentrations of both lone parents, predominantly women, and black workers that would live in poorer quality housing in Scotland. So all of these issues actually impacted, and they exist in Scotland. And they just simply the pandemic just shone a light on them in terms of our unfair advantage that some people have and the lack of advantage that people have. We have many people, particularly disabled people, who live in poverty, and a lot of people are in work poverty, where they are working, but it is not really sometimes worth their time to work. And also disabled people have much higher costs in terms of their outgoings for a variety of reasons. That could be heating related or other things that they need. So sick pay had a huge disproportionate impact, particularly on women, disabled workers and black workers. Again, if you look at the segregation that there is into the different types of sectors that they work in and the roles within those sectors, and then overlap that onto both those that contracted COVID and those that died, it was very evident that that is where the problems lay.
Thank you. Ms. Makadenge, you noted in your statement a cultural reluctance among black workers to disclose health issues. How did that reluctance affect their ability to shield or access support?
I think, first of all, the reluctance was due to cultural. It's something which is in black people's culture that you don't disclose your illnesses unless if necessary. Okay. And at the same time, I don't think information, they had enough information to know that if they had disclosed, they could have been paid when they were home. They didn't know about that because it was not very clear what was going to happen. And at the same time, black people, since they always work in low-paid jobs, they always make their living by doing extra work. So if they were going to shield, it means no extra work, less money on the table. So that's why it impacted them as well, and thought, I would rather go to work rather than shielding, because obviously the money that I get is not enough.
Thank you. Ms. Ferguson, did you observe specific intersectional impacts where disability overlapped with other characteristics, such as gender, rurality, or poverty? Were there particular intersections that stood out more?
Yes, there were. I'll start with rural living. I am based in Orkney, and Orkney communities are spread over multiple islands. The actual hospital is on Orkney mainland, so if you want access to that from one of the smaller islands, you've got to travel in by ferry, unless it's an emergency, in which case you would have access to air ambulance. We had fewer restrictions than the mainland Scotland, but during the full lockdown, there would be difficulties such as not being able to access taxis and other types of transport if you didn't have a car of your own, which quite a number of disabled people don't have, particularly if they're visually impaired. There was also a massive loss of the tourist trade, which would have a large part of the island income, which would have affected disabled people within the community who derive part of their income from the tourist trade. In terms of gender, we are aware that disability occurs at a higher proportion in women than men, so they were going to be affected at a higher rate than by the pandemic, the risk, the jobs that they were working, the shielding, things like that. It would have been harder for the LGBT plus people to leave their home, to leave difficult living situations, especially if they were also disabled and they needed very specific housing requirements. Linda has already mentioned that that housing tends to be a problem. It is very, very difficult to get accessible housing if you're disabled. And poverty, we've talked about that a little bit already. Disabled people are more likely to be living in poverty, and this might be because they're unable to work themselves, or a family member is acting as a carer and they're not able to work because of the caring duty. There's an extra cost of the disability, that things like equipment. If you're at home, you're going to need more heating. If you've got dialysis equipment, you need a lot of electricity. There's a number of things in terms of equipment, but even simply buying the equipment, if you're blind and you need a braille display, we're talking an electronic braille display, we're talking £5,000, £6,000, which is not something you buy every day. There were people who were paying for social care, and that affects the money that they have available for other things. We are aware that 48% of all people in poverty in the UK are actually disabled or live with a disabled person, so it is a major issue in terms of poverty and disability, the intersection. There's also the issue of digital exclusion. If you can't afford the technology or the broadband, which would have meant it was harder to access information about the pandemic and instructions that were being given by governments.
Thank you. Ms. Ferguson, I want to just follow up on something you mentioned there. You said that it was more difficult for LGBT plus people to leave their homes, and particularly if they were disabled. I just wondered, could you explain to us what it is that makes it more difficult for LGBTQ plus people in particular to leave their homes if needed?
Well, specifically during the pandemic, given the restriction, you were expected to live within the bubble of your family. And if you lived with a group of other people, you weren't able to interact with people from other households. If you were living by yourself, but this wouldn't be the problem here. If you're living by yourself, you wouldn't have a difficult living situation caused by the people you were living with. So if I focus on a multiple person household, the people that you're living with may not be supportive of your gender or your sexual orientation, and this can lead to a very untenable situation for that LGBT plus person, which means that they need to move. But if you in rural places particularly, there is a lack of accommodation to move to, and it's always difficult to find somewhere to move, and you've got to explain this is a real emergency. It's not just me having a wee tantrum because somebody doesn't like the fact that I'm a lesbian or transgender or something.
Thank you. That's helpful. Now, we've touched on poverty, but more broadly than that, I want to focus for the next question on socio-economic class beyond just poverty. How much significance did the intersectionality of socio-economic class with protected characteristics have on the impacts experienced by each of the groups you represent? Perhaps we could start with you, Ms. Somerville.
Yeah, there was a huge impact. I mean, as we've said already, some of the inequalities in Scotland were already evident, and this just kind of brought it all to light. I think you need to think about the sense of layering here, where you think about layering of inequality, disadvantage and discrimination. And when you put all them together, then you can understand why there's a bigger impact for different groups of people. pre-COVID, people who had from different protected characteristic groups would likely to have different employment experiences in terms of access to the labour market and progression in the labour market. And it's quite, well documented, whether that's women not being able to move into certain professions, being corralled into different types of professions, women who take on the greatest share of childcare and therefore can't pursue decent jobs or careers. And that can be also seen in evidence for disabled workers and for some of the points that Julie's made around the disproportionate impact of them trying to access quality jobs, and indeed black workers as well. So you can see already that people's interaction with the labour market and where their starting point was quite different. They didn't have the same opportunity or indeed privilege as many other groups of workers would have had. And when you think about that from a housing point of view as well, and we touched on housing, but I think it's really important as well to think about in terms of public health, what is the impact of poor housing for people that are in different protected characteristic groups. And then if you look at beyond that, to then think about how people were actually supported during that time. Now, if you're in a workplace where it's an organised workplace where there's good trade unions and there's good recognition with your employer and there's a good industrial relations, you were much more likely to feel confident in coming forward. But if you are in a workplace which is often a lower paid workplace, or your job is 0 hours, which we touched on earlier, because you're one of those groups and therefore you're also socioeconomic disadvantage, the power that you have in the workplace is a complete imbalance. So therefore for people to say, oh, well, you had the right to request time off for vaccination or the right to request do whatever, if you're A, unaware of your rights, or B, feel that you do not have the agency to take them forward and articulate them because you may lose your job or be otherwise discriminated at work, you're not going to do that. And that's much more likely to happen to women in the workplace, to black workers, to disabled workers and LGBT workers, and indeed young workers who are very vulnerable as well at work and tend often not to be in such organised workplaces. So there was a whole kind of intersection between those that were from the poorest backgrounds in Scotland, those with less access to the labour market or to indeed to be supported through education into better jobs, and those that were from different protected characteristics.
Thank you. Ms. Makadengi, do you have anything?
I don't have anything to add. I think she's covered everything.
Great. Thank you. Ms. Ferguson, do you have anything to add?
I don't have anything to add.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Somerville, how did the STUC try to ensure intersectionality was embedded in its policy recommendations to the government?
I suppose what we did was not explicitly around intersectionality, but we always had an eye for it in terms of trying to make sure that all our equality groups were represented at things and brought their evidence together and their issues together to take that to government. I mean, we did things like we had an equality survey that we did of people from different protected characteristics groups. We held webinars on equalities in COVID, and they weren't just for women or just for LGBT workers. We tended to bring all the groups together to do that, and that we found both common themes and common trends, and then we could play that back to government at the meetings that we had, and ask them to kind of look at that from that kind of collective perspective. Workers, like every other group of people, are multi-dimensional in lots of points, and you can't simply corral someone into one part of their protected characteristics. We all have different parts of our identity that we carry, so that often played out, as I say, it was more evident because of the type of sectors people worked in or the jobs that they did, often then for amplified what those protected characteristics were and how they might have come out. So a black woman worker would have had quite a different experience because of the type of employment that they were in compared to a black male worker, or indeed to a white man who was working in manufacturing. So they would have had different experiences and different exposure to the virus at different times. So we tried to make sure that the issues that were raised by our equality groups, we fed into government to say that they needed to think about this in the widest form and to put that into their policies.
Thank you. I want to move on to access to information and communications. Was public health messaging during the pandemic accessible to the communities you represent? And what improvements would you suggest for inclusive communications in future emergencies? If we could start with you, Ms. Ferguson, please.
Thank you. Public health messaging. The main type of public health messaging was the lunchtime live broadcast that Nicola Sturgeon did on TV. And these would be accessible to most people in terms of it was the spoken language, so blind people with good hearing, hearing people in general would be able to understand. But they also always had a BSL interpreter, which meant that deaf people who were BSL users would also be able to access the live broadcast. However, the main group of people that wouldn't be able to access the live broadcast were deaf non-BSL users, because the live broadcast meant that the subtitles were delayed. The subtitles wouldn't always reflect what was being said, and it was very difficult to follow. So there needed to be other sources. In terms of improving the live broadcast, what I would suggest is that they're transmitted a second time later in the day once an opportunity has been made to put in the subtitles in time with the speaking so that it can be followed properly. I would point out that the Scottish Government website was not very easy to search or read if you were looking to back up the information that you collected from the live broadcast. In terms of reading it, there probably needed to be more easy-read formats available. From my own perspective, I found that Twitter was a really good source of information, particularly the First Minister's Twitter account, because I was able to read it out in my own time, think about it, look up information based on the back of that. Yeah, that would be accessibility.
Thank you. Ms. Makadenge, do you?
I would add on language barriers. Maybe the information could have been put in other languages which other people can, especially those who come from non-speaking English countries, it could have helped them. And at the same time, Ms. Ferguson had told that it was only televised during the day, midday, and then the black workers, we knew they were on the front line, they were working. By the time they come at night, it was not coming again. And access to get it from online, some of them, they don't even have laptops or fancy mobile phones where they can get the information. So next time, I think things need to be looked at, that it can be televised maybe every couple of hours and also in other languages.
Thank you. Ms. Somerville.
Just briefly, I know that Scottish Government did look at kind of accessible comms. We were not directly involved in that, but we had some sight of it. We had input when necessary, and they did look at putting things into other languages. I don't know how quick they were to do that. And also, I think their problem might have been trying to distribute it to the groups that needed it and to get that messaging out there. So I think for government, there's probably an issue around them having access to the communities and also having the trust of those communities that this information was correct.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to vaccination and testing strategies. Ms. Ferguson, in December 2020, during the vaccine rollout, you say in your statement that you raised concerns about immunocompromised and disabled individuals. Were these concerns adequately addressed by the Scottish Government?
I believe they were adequately addressed by the Scottish Government. Part of the reason I was asking detailed questions was because I wanted to understand the vaccine rollout in terms of how it was going to be supporting disabled people who would need access to the vaccine earlier. And so the government minister explained the plan for particularly the elderly people, and then everybody who was in a shielding category, and then the rest of the population by age. So that was really helpful to understand. I did ask other questions, and I received answers that showed me that they had been considered in the planning.
Yeah, thank you. And that's the next question I had for you, that you'd raised concerns around vaccine safety for certain groups of people and herd immunity. You'd asked about ingredients which certain individuals might be allergic to, or the impact on those who were immunocompromised and couldn't have the vaccine, and also the stage at which herd immunity might be achieved. Do you recall the responses you received in relation to those questions?
Not in detail. However, I do remember that I felt that my concerns had been addressed. The herd immunity question in particular became irrelevant because at that point we weren't fully aware of the fact that the COVID vaccine didn't completely protect you from infection, that you could still be infected, but it would lead to an infection with less symptoms and less danger for you. So herd immunity wasn't something that was achievable with this type of with vaccine. Immunocompromised people who couldn't receive the vaccine ingredient, I don't remember the details, but I do believe that they were addressed properly.
Thank you. Ms. Makadenge, in your statement, you comment on misinformation surrounding the vaccine. To what extent did misinformation or lack of targeted communication affect vaccine uptake in Black communities?
First of all, because the vaccine came within a short space of time, so Black people were a bit worried whether this has been researched enough to be able to get it. And also, there was also a misconception saying at first pregnant women were not supposed to be vaccinated. And then, so the people were saying, also, if you get the vaccine, if you still need to have children, you are not going to have children. So that was another problem, which also Black people were a bit hesitant to take it if they still wanted, if they were still in a bearing age.
Thank you. And you mentioned, Ms. Makadenge, in your statement, Black people travelling home to see families and so on. Did the workers you represent feel pressured to be vaccinated in order to work or travel? And if so, did socioeconomic status or job type affect the likelihood of that?
Yeah, 100%. They felt they were, they had to, even if they didn't want, they had to get vaccinated because they needed to travel to see their families back home. And that time I remember people who have traveled, I have traveled. That time I know you were asked to be tested or were you vaccinated. Both airports you need to show your vaccination status. So when you have other family on the other side of the world, definitely you end up taking it. It's like you were pressured to take it. And at the same time, people were also asked to quarantine when they were coming back. And those are the people who have low-paid jobs, and they were asked to go in a hotel for 7 days and pay. So I just think something could have been done better rather than making the people more poorer. And yet they were not visiting for pleasure or for holiday. It's either it was sickness or death.
Thank you. Ms. Somerville and Ms. Ferguson, I wonder if you have anything to add to that, if workers you represent also experienced that situation, whether for travel or for work. If we start with you, Ms. Somerville.
In terms of people being pushed to take vaccines?
Yes. And whether their socioeconomic status influenced the sort of push for that in their type of work?
I suppose there was a strong encouragement from government that people, particularly in health and social care, which would have had a direct impact on women workers and Black workers disproportionately, to be vaccinated. In terms of trade unions, what we would have done is made sure that we represented members who did not want to take the vaccine and made sure that their rights to do that were upheld as well.
Great. Thank you. Ms. Ferguson, did that apply to disabled workers?
In terms of disabled workers, it was not made clear to me that disabled workers felt pressure to take the vaccine, but I can't say that nobody felt that way, but from my own experience, I didn't come across that. There was a concern when vaccine passports were being discussed, because a vaccine passport was being seen as a way to have the status of your COVID vaccination present, and we were concerned in terms of the possible discrimination that would cause against disabled people who couldn't be vaccinated, but that didn't actually come to anything in the end.
Okay, thank you. Ms Somerville, you touched there on unions being supportive of individuals' rights regarding the vaccine. Did you have instances where workers approached unions for help to challenge their employers, either directly or via tribunals?
There would have been individual cases, but our trade unions themselves would know about that. I wouldn't. I'm sure there would have been individual cases. I don't know about any that went to tribunal, but certainly what we did do, and I know of one sector, because we tended to deal with things across sectors, where we raised a significant concern with the Scottish Government, and they acted on it, was in the oil and gas industry, where you had workers who would normally be going offshore to work on the rigs, but they were told that unless they had been vaccinated and they had evidence of that, they were having to quarantine for up to 5 days in hotels before they went, and they weren't paid for those 5 days. They were only paid when they actually got offshore, and they also were not always having their hotel costs covered. So workers that would normally be used to flying in and out were suddenly being put in this situation that was hugely financially detriment to them, and being excluded from being able to take up their jobs because of it. And their trade union brought that to the COVID group. We raised that with Scottish Government, said it was unacceptable and that alternatives had to be found around that, and then Scottish Government took that off to speak to the industry about it. I don't know the outcome of that. It would have been dealt with through the industry groups for that sector and the unions involved, but we did raise that as a specific issue to say that, as I say, whilst we were unions were supportive of public health guidance, and we did support vaccination rollout, because we felt that that was in the best interest to protect workers, and the evidence showed us that at the time. What we didn't do was make sure that all workers were vaccinated or take that line. Far from it. We supported those that didn't want to for whatever reason, and for those that were put in a difficult position with their employer, and the offshore is an example of that.
Thank you. Now, what changes would you recommend for future vaccination and testing strategies to ensure equity? Perhaps we could start with you, Ms Ferguson.
Changes to future vaccination and testing strategies. For disabled people, it's important to make sure that they're able to travel to the vaccination or testing facility, because I mentioned earlier with the certain pandemic restrictions, you wouldn't have access to the transport. Obviously, it's very important to make sure that the building itself is accessible. One of the issues that we came across during the pandemic was that some people who were mask exempt were actually pressured, told to put their face mask on during their vaccination, and that is something people shouldn't be pressured to put on a face mask if they're exempt. Another aspect of the vaccination would be to vaccinate unpaid carers at the same time as employed carers, because I came across unpaid carers who were being vaccinated during their age group, but not earlier in the vaccination process like employed carers were. And this was a major difficulty for them because they were responsible for people who were vulnerable, perhaps elderly, or disabled and shielding, and they were the people that were going out and doing the shopping, coming in and supporting that disabled person or the elderly person. So it's important to make sure unpaid carers are vaccinated earlier in the process. For the testing kits, I'm sure we all recall the testing kits with the little instruction sheet and the little swabs and things. The instructions are very small, which makes it quite difficult to read. So there should be large print options available, perhaps Braille version, that could be handed out on request with a testing kit. There should be easy read instructions that would support people that are, for example, dyslexic. And yeah, that's my list.
Thank you. Ms. Makadenge, if we could come to you.
I think black people were supposed to be a priority. Remember, there was a priority that age and everything going down. I think they should have been a priority as well on the list, since most of them were on the front line and working on jobs which were at risk. And at the same time, if the vaccination could have been to place of work so that they don't need to do it on their off days, I think that could have helped, and most people could have got the vaccines earlier.
Thank you. Ms. Somerville.
Yeah, just briefly, I think one of the things to do would be to work with trade unions much more closely to identify vaccine rollout and the priorities groups that were. I mean, we struggled to get, for example, workers that were in essential transport vaccinated. So you had maybe people working in the community, taking people to and from schools, for example, and those drivers seemed to not be essential, and yet people working in schools, teachers were, obviously. So, or they were essential workers, but they weren't priority for the vaccine. But all of this is kind of precluded on the idea that there's going to be scarcity, because that was the other issue. There wasn't enough vaccine. So I suppose the thoughts we would have would be around saying if there was not scarcity and vaccine was able to be available and produced in numbers, we might not face the same challenges of pitting one group of workers or one group of protected with protected characteristics against another. And actually we could be much more engaged in working out what should be done in what order in order to make sure that people were safe and took the vaccine if they wanted to.
Thank you. And I have an eye on time. We're coming to the end of our session. I wonder whether each of you have anything in particular that you would like to highlight at this point, or anything that we've touched on that you would like to particularly emphasise. If we could start with you, Ms. Somerville.
Do you mean in terms of lessons learned?
Yes, or anything we've not covered that you would like to have aired.
Okay, in terms of lessons learned, because that's the kind of, the thing that we've been trying to spend some time thinking about. There's a few areas. I mean, one of the issues that we also took to government regularly was about improving their data, and they were struggling at times to give us the information on disaggregating data, particularly for black workers in different economic groups, in different parts of the labour market. So there's something about evidence that we needed really early on that wasn't available that might have helped inform them, not just for black workers but for other workers. So there's something about government improving the data and understanding where people are working and what they are doing that would be really helpful. I've mentioned briefly earlier about resource implications for organisations that you're engaging with. If you want to work with small organisations who have a key role to inform your policy, they need to be resourced to do so. One of the things as well that caused significant difficulty, and I think this is evidenced in social care hearings as well, is that because our social care infrastructure in Scotland is very fragmented, we have private providers as well as third sector providers and local authority providers, it meant that the information and guidance that was needed wasn't making it out, sometimes particularly into those private providers, or they were choosing to ignore it. The health and social care is a key component. Nothing works in health unless you can have social care right, because as we can see, what the two are completely interlinked. And I think that there's an issue around the ownership of our social care system and how it's managed and governed and run that meant that it caused significant difficulty both for those that are service users and also for people working in that, and taking profit margins out of that would have helped enormously. In terms of what trade unions can do and what should be done to support them to help protect workers, we saw the vital role that trade unions had during the pandemic, where often they were the only people on the ground that were actually helping to stop exploitative practices by employers. And therefore, to make that firmer and better in the future, we would want to expand collective bargaining in Scotland and to make sure that trade union access was there. And Scottish Government, while they don't have control over employment law, we would like to see that devolved to the Scottish Parliament. But what they don't have, they do have control over Scottish Government funding and grant giving. And there is some conditionality attached to that just now, but not enough. We would like to see that much stronger to say that there needs to be trade union recognition and access given trade unions for those in receipt of public funding. Government would argue that that's employment law and they can't do that. We would say it's contractual law and that they can do that. So we'd like to see that expanded. And I suppose really what we saw during the pandemic was a test of the resilience of our public services. And sadly, in many cases in Scotland, they failed, particularly in social care and in areas in health, which were devastated in terms of the impact it's had on those workers. People still suffering from PTSD that worked in those areas and still find it really difficult to talk about it. And some of the areas, local authorities as well, local authorities are frontline providers, people who were dealing with housing emergencies, dealing with people who needed services from their local authorities. And they're often not thought of in the same way because they weren't seen out and about. But local authorities, health, education, social care and other parts of our public services, sometimes they failed. And if they didn't fail, it tended to be because workers made absolutely heroic efforts to step up and make sure that people were protected, their service users and the people that they looked after. And sadly, some of those workers paid the ultimate price and lost their lives because of it. So we would want to make sure in the future that we can only really prepare properly for another pandemic by having properly funded public sector in Scotland that has the resilience in it and the flexibility to be agile and adaptable during such crisis times. And lastly, we're talking about how we would protect equality and human rights. We need to stop the exploitation of workers and the discrimination that they face at work. We need better legislation to do that. We need improved trade unions on the ground to recognise that imbalance of power that there is in the workplace. And to tackle the structural inequalities that there is across Scotland, we need to fund our public services better and think seriously about how we redistribute wealth across Scotland.
Thank you. Ms Ferguson, I wonder whether there's anything you wish to add or highlight?
I would, thank you. I think that disabled people need to be included in pre-pandemic planning and in pandemic planning from the beginning of the pandemic. I've touched on this already, but it's something I want to emphasise at this point, that we need to be included because we are very flexible, creative thinking people. We have disabilities that we constantly have to figure out how to work around in order to be able to participate in society. We can contribute. A rather specific thing that we also need to ensure is access to food during lockdown, because this was something that was difficult for disabled people in some places to be able to do. If you couldn't go to the shop in person, you needed to try to do online shopping, but quite often the other able-bodied people would be using the online shopping for understandable reasons, which meant disabled people wouldn't be able to get slots. And food is a basic requirement. I'd also like to point out that public officials do have a role to play in demonstrating that the rules are there to be followed and that there are consequences if the rules are broken. We had multiple cases of that where trust was broken because all of us on the ground were doing what we were told. We were being fined if one of the rules was broken, and we could see people swanning about and not receiving any kind of consequences. The last thing I would like to add here is the importance of support for mental health, because access to mental health support for existing mental health conditions during the pandemic was very difficult for people, but also the pandemic itself gave rise to new mental health conditions in many people across the population, and people just did not have the support they needed. There was not enough mental health support in any part of the country.
Thank you. And Ms Makadenge?
I would like to say maybe the other thing that we need to do, or the Scottish Government need to do in future, is to make sure when there is a pandemic, to act fast, and at the same time keep all the information that helped us in the past pandemic, so that when it comes, we know what really worked and what didn't work. And also, the Scottish Government need to consider those who have little or no income, as they also need to survive. People were going to work when they should not have done that due to the fact that they needed money to feed their families. And also ask the Scottish government also needs to ensure that it looks and treats migrants the same as they treat the Scottish people. Especially during pandemic when people were not allowed to visit their families for sickness or for when their loved one is passed on, we felt undervalued. We also felt that our families were not considered. What they wanted was just for us to work, forgetting about our families. So this is something that they should consider. And also to make sure that black people are also given jobs in other areas where they will be able to decide, to help to decide, and also to let the government know the things that matters for them most. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are all the questions there.
Thank you, Ms. Brani. Thank you all for your evidence today. That's all. 11:30 for the next session.
All rise.
Good morning, Mr Dunlop.
Good morning, my lord. The next witness today is Dr Nolan of Inclusion Scotland.
Good morning, Dr Nolan.
Good morning, my lord.
Yes, when you're ready, Mr Dunlop.
Thank you, my lord. Good morning, Dr Nolan. You've provided the inquiry with a statement which should hopefully be up on the screen in front of you in due course. And does that statement comprise your evidence to the inquiry today? I'll come to that. I appreciate there's an error, with the exception of paragraph 30, which I'll come to.
Paragraph 30.
Yes.
Yeah, I believe it's.
Well, let's do that just now then. Let's look at paragraph 30. Am I correct that when essentially you've been reading through this and you've noticed there's an error in paragraph 30, is that correct?
Yeah, I'd like to thank the Scottish Vaccine Injuries Group who brought this to my attention with their questions. I mentioned a report on England and I got the statistic wrong because I'm remembering back from 5-6 years ago about the number of people with learning disabilities that died.
Well, well, why don't we look at paragraph 30 and you can tell us precisely what it is that's... if we look through it, it says... Could I maybe just read it? Would that be helpful? If
Sure,
and you can tell me where the error is?
Yeah.
So it says, disabled people represent a highly diverse group with a wide range of impairments and conditions, making it challenging to capture comprehensive evidence. A report from England found that individuals with learning disabilities had a disproportionate high mortality rate compared to the general population. Is that correct up to there?
It is correct up to there. Yeah.
So it's the last sentence we're dealing with, which states, this was linked to multiple health inequalities, with the report noting that 33% of those with a learning disability had died.
I believe that's incorrect and misremembered. It was linked to multiple health inequalities, and so there was a report from Public Health England that showed that people with a learning disability died from COVID-19 at 6 times the rate of the general population. That 8 out of 10 deaths of people with learning disability were COVID-related that year in 2020, and that 65% of those with a learning disability who died with COVID in the first wave in England had another impairment. And it also said that young people, and this may be where I'd misrecalled, it was quite a shocking figure in itself, that young people with learning disabilities aged 18 to 34 were 30 times more likely to die of COVID than non-disabled young adults. Yes, I misrecalled.
Formative in actual fact.
Yeah, I've looked into it. So
we have
I'm
a note
grateful
of that,
for
do we?
Yes, there's Dr Nolan sent in a further document essentially identifying which can be
Thank you for doing that.
Recorded as a document in the inquiry. Whilst it's not normally, I would go back to the beginning and we'd start, but since we're at paragraph 30, could I perhaps just ask you a couple of supplementary questions whilst we're there? The English report that you referred to, did it state what the causes of death were?
Well, the causes of death were COVID-19, but the report talks about health inequalities this group were facing prior to COVID, and that includes things that I mentioned in my evidence, including, so they didn't go into detail in what I read of the report, but they might have done in the full report. But I mentioned in my evidence various health inequalities, including if a person had more than one impairment, or if so an example would be diagnostic overshadowing, where somebody would go to the doctor with symptoms, but it would be attributed to their impairment that the doctor was aware of, and potentially not. It might be missed that they had something else, and that happens quite regularly with people with learning disabilities. And the other thing is, and you know, you hope that this is being addressed more so, but lack of time for appointments for people with learning disabilities, like extra additional time to fully explain what's wrong with them and support to do that. So that's just 2 examples of the health inequalities faced by people with learning disabilities that potentially put them more at risk.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
May sound rather picky, but it's just to help us. You use there, and I can understand what you mean, diagnostic overshadowing, but is that, and of course this is where I have a difficulty that I'm not entirely sure what your academic or professional background is at the moment, but is that a recognised term either in medicine or in your particular speciality, or is it, and it's not a complaint if it is, or a criticism if it is, or is it just a form of language that you have used for the purposes of expressing your opinion?
I've taken it from academic literature around women and disabled women who've been victims of domestic abuse.
Thank you. That's clearer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, my Lord. And just one more, or perhaps two more questions about paragraph 30 before we look at your statement from the beginning. In terms of, you're referring to an English report which may come up in the UKI. Do you know if there is an equivalent Scottish report?
I didn't, but I've looked it up. So there was a Scottish Government publication, I think it was Public Health Scotland, who found in that of this census sample, there were 36 deaths from COVID-19 in the learning disability, intellectual disabilities population, compared with 199 deaths among the general population. So overall, people in this population, people with learning disabilities, were more than 3 times more likely to die from COVID-19 than the general population.
Thank you, Dr. Nolan. I'll take you now, because I suppose conventionally through your statement from the beginning. I suppose first, I'm addressing you as Dr. Nolan. Are you a medical doctor?
No, I have a PhD.
And what's the PhD in?
Social anthropology.
And what position do you hold within Inclusion Scotland?
I'm Head of Participation and Policy at Inclusion Scotland and a member of the senior management team.
And if you had to summarise briefly what Inclusion Scotland does and what your role within Inclusion Scotland is, can you do that for us?
Inclusion Scotland is a disabled people's organisation. We're an Equalities and Human Rights organisation. We represent a network of disabled people's organisations and individual disabled people across Scotland. We use the social model of disability, which says that disabled people are disabled by the oppressions and barriers that they face in society, and that if they didn't face those barriers, they would simply be impaired or have conditions that were to be managed. But the social model says that society causes barriers and oppressions that disabled people face. Inclusion Scotland does work on policy, research, we do work on employment, practice, and we run an access to elected office programme. In my department, we do policy, research, people-led policy, which is people co-producing reform of policy with the Scottish Government, and we run the Access to Elected Office programme that brings disabled people onto an equal playing field with others when campaigning for elected office in Scottish and council elections.
Thank you. And you say disabled people. We've heard from organisations that represent particular segments of disabled people, perhaps young or perhaps people with profound learning difficulties. Do you cover, or sorry, does Inclusion Scotland cover the whole spectrum range of disabled persons?
We're what's called a pan-impairment or pan-disability organisation. So we cover everyone of the variety of impairments, conditions and age groups and other characteristics as well. So we take an intersectional approach.
Thank you. At paragraphs 16 to 18 of your statement, you identify that Inclusion Scotland was not involved in any pre-pandemic planning. I'm just wondering, do you have a view on whether you would have added value, your organisation would have added value, had it been involved in pre-pandemic planning?
Yes, we would absolutely have added value because disabled people know best the solutions to the barriers that affect them. There's a right in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, the UN Convention, Article 11 that says disabled people and their organisations should be involved in emergency planning for any kind of emergency event. So that might include a pandemic, that might include climate change, etc. And we were not aware of any emergency planning being done, and if we had been, we would have wanted a seat around that table, as we do with other high-level decisions being made that might, you know, around issues that might disproportionately affect disabled people.
Thank you. In terms of, and this might be with the benefit of hindsight, but in relation to pre-pandemic planning, is there something that you say could have been done better in relation to, you know, disabled persons?
Yeah, there's a range of things that could have been done better. Communications, for one thing. You know, we had to advise the Scottish Parliament that they needed BSL translation of the First Minister's announcement, and that didn't happen at the UK level until long after. So, but because we deal more with Scottish Parliament, for example. So it's things like that, accessible communications. We have the expertise because we work with disabled people themselves, and we get their lived expertise, they get their experience of what day-to-day life is. So if they're having, you know, if they get social care support, then they were more likely to be impacted by a reduction of social care support. If they had disabled children, they would be more likely to be impacted by the closure of additional support and schools and so on, and centres that might provide support for those children, other carers. The list goes on. We know what happened, but we could have better anticipated the impacts because we know how disabled people's lives might be affected. Thank you.
And moving on to paragraph 27, you tell us that as a consequence of the pandemic, your organisation, Inclusion Scotland, prepared a report titled Rights at Risk. Can you tell me what was the purpose of that report?
We'd done a survey of disabled people with over 800 responses, and the purpose of the report was to go through specific human rights of disabled people and look at how they'd been impacted through the findings of that survey. And it was to educate, inform, to influence recommendations of any future inquiry such as this as well.
You said there it was to educate, inform and influence. What was the report used in any way with the Scottish Government or any other public authorities? Yeah, we used it when giving evidence to the Scottish Parliament Committee on Health, on the, you know, the impacts of, for example, the law that was brought in or the impacts of the COVID pandemic. We would have used it in briefings, and we've used it since in manifestos. You know, we know that the pandemic impacted disabled people, so here's what needs to happen next. So we used it in the 2021 manifesto and so on. I was going to ask, when was the report prepared approximately? Can you remember?
2020, right. Shortly after the survey closed. We very quickly got on it.
And was that just after the pandemic had started, essentially? Was that early in the... It
was summer 2020,
summer.
Yeah. And then we went on to do follow-up surveys, so that was the baseline.
And in terms of, you've told us presenting it, the purpose of it, one of the purposes you mentioned was to influence. Did it influence decision-making at a Scottish Government or other level?
That's hard to say, actually. We did try and get involved with decision making, and our CAO at the time was very forward in, you know, informally contacting important decision makers, so perhaps tweeting them and say, you know, this is a finding, listen to this, what are you going to do next? And she managed to get some meetings on the basis of that, but I don't have a full record of all those meetings.
And when you say important people, are we talking about Cabinet Minister level?
Or for example, Jason Leach,
right.
Chief Medical Officer.
And do you know if your organisation sat on any of the Scottish group kind of Scottish Government working groups in relation to anything that would be relevant to disabled persons?
We sat on the First Minister's recovery group, which was put in place in 2021, the Deputy First Minister's recovery roundtables in 2021.
And
we had a meeting with a group of GPs to give them advice on vaccinations as well, and we were involved in a group looking at potential equality impacts of setting up vaccination centres. So various things, but I don't recall them all or have records of them all.
And at paragraph 28, you mentioned the sudden withdrawal of social care support, and we've heard about this from other witnesses, but I just want to make sure we're talking about the same thing. When you talk about social care support, what are you talking about?
About domiciliary care in people's own homes. So people that rely on formal supports, whether that be from support workers, so through self-directed support, from support workers either sent from an organisation or through unpaid carers or through personal assistance that they've had through option 1 or mixture.
And I think later on in your, I don't have the exact reference in front of me, but I think later on you said that you referred to people sleeping in wheelchairs. Is that, have I picked that up correctly?
We heard that through our survey work, and we had other things told to us by our people-led policy panel that specifically works on social care support. So yeah, there was, at least one example of someone having to sleep in their wheelchair because they weren't given the support to go to bed or to get up in the morning.
And can I ask, in terms of post-pandemic, have the levels of social care support returned to the levels they were at pre-pandemic?
We don't believe so. We've got no hard evidence for that, but we know from people that at the time they were very worried that if they were seen to, if they were viewed as not needing the levels of support they got, then they wouldn't get that, package of social care support reinstated. And we do know that that has happened through follow-up surveys, but the numbers were not as great as the original survey, so we don't know to what extent that happened.
And at paragraph 31, you identify that health inequalities puts disabled people at a disadvantage, and the pandemic magnified that issue. And you go on to say at paragraph 32 that there was a lack of healthcare and therapeutic services. When you talk about healthcare and therapeutic services, what are you referring to?
There's lots of examples that we were told about, but people would have standard appointments that were just cancelled. So as well as the social care support that they were getting, potentially they didn't, they didn't get access to health centres, to hospital appointments, which were stopped suddenly in order to manage ongoing conditions and the impacts of their impairments. And, another example might be that somebody in our people-led policy panel mentioned that they used to go to beauty salons to get a certain treatment that helped with their muscular function, Botox, and that had gone and that they were experiencing pain and discomfort since, for months because they weren't getting that regular treatment through a beauty salon. So it wasn't just the formal health supports, it could be a therapy pool which people relied on to keep up their health, but they couldn't necessarily go out for walks as people were advised to do. There's lots of things that disabled people use and need to manage their health care that just disappeared.
Thank you. And you discuss communications at paragraph 36, and you say that information was often unavailable in accessible formats. Who was providing that information?
Government, councils, any formal decision makers that were providing information. So, I mentioned earlier, the First Minister was giving daily announcements, and at first that didn't come with BSL translation live. And other examples might include easy read information on looking after yourself, on keeping safe. So that would be for that group that were more at risk of people with learning disabilities. You know, there's a range of communication support that disabled people might need, and they have a right to, that it wasn't as much available then, or it wasn't coming through in official formats of information because the rate at which things were coming out was fast. It was all about speed and getting things out and changing guidance and so on. So they weren't thinking we need to get these out in multiple formats. There's potential for other disabled groups of potentially people with language barriers as well, other than BSL. For example, if they speak another language, that they weren't getting necessarily those translated documents or information.
And I think we know in terms of the First Minister's announcements, I think if I'm correct, Inclusion Scotland influenced the decision for there to be an interpreter.
We did.
Yes. But in terms of the other aspects, did Inclusion Scotland manage to influence other bodies, whether it be local councils or? We did it. We did work on that. Different parts of the organisation. So I'm not sure what, but yeah, we did always promote it. For example, easy read information. But then, you know, different departments in Scottish Government, they would take that on board and they would do it, and then civil servants would move on and something else would come out. So a prime example would be the National Care Service consultation, which was still, I think, the bill consultation which came out in 2021. So it's still during the height of the COVID pandemic, as we say. And that didn't come out in easy read, but had the potential to really, you know, we know that people with learning disabilities were potentially dying of COVID-19 and also not getting the social care support that they needed. And this National Care Service bill, they were a key stakeholder, but they didn't have the information in an accessible format that they needed. We went to Scottish Government, we took People First Scotland with us, and we convinced them that they needed to extend the consultation period, and they did so, and they introduced an easy read version, summary version of the frankly massive consultation document that they'd done. Thank you. And you go on to discuss human rights after paragraph 38, and you discuss disabled people not being able to work and relying on social security, and you also say at paragraph 61 that disabled people lost their jobs because of COVID. I'm just wondering, obviously a number of people lost their jobs because of COVID. I'm just wondering if there's a particular distinction or a particular impact that you want to give evidence on in relation to disabled people.
Right, so a higher proportion of disabled people are traditionally employed in public administration, so a range of sort of jobs that were more likely to be impacted by the various measures that were taken. So public administration, education, health, distribution, accommodation, catering sectors compared to the non-disabled population. And these were the sectors that were more severely impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. So that resulted in job losses, but it wasn't just that. I mean, it was exposure, the risk of exposure to the virus, potentially through family members that went out of work if they were at risk themselves, so potentially carers. And we had around 22% of survey respondents to that original survey reporting that they or a family member worked in a role that put them at risk of contracting COVID-19. So that's about a fifth of the population, and it's matches about the population of disabled people in Scotland, and suggested that disabled people faced higher workplace exposure risk compared to non-disabled people. The other thing was that people might have been shielding because they were at higher risk, so they were really worried about losing their work because they couldn't continue to shield. For example, if they'd been made to stay at home, I can't remember the word for it right now, if they were made to stay at home, it was that word that was used all the time. Can you help me? No, from work. They weren't allowed to work for a period.
Furloughed, is it?
Furlough, thank you. If they were on furlough, they were really, really anxious that once things opened up again, they were sent back to work, because of their continued high risk, they wouldn't be allowed to shield and continue to work, and they would lose their jobs. So that was a real risk, and probably, you know, did likely happen to people, and that, you know, many people were not on the shielding list, so they would have been people high at risk of getting COVID who had discussed this with their doctors but hadn't received the Chief Medical Officer letter saying they could shield officially, so they had no proof to offer to their workplace that they were on the shielding list.
And I think you mentioned that later in your statement. In terms of those disabled persons that did lose their jobs as a result of COVID, have they managed to get back, or do you know if they've managed to get back into the workforce, or if they remain out of work?
We don't know. We do know that disabled people face higher barriers to getting into work if they're out of work because of various barriers, such as attitudes is a big one, and we know that, you know, the employment gap is still to be worked on, to be reduced by Scottish Government. There's a commitment there. But we don't know exactly what the experiences were of disabled people who lost their jobs due to that.
You go on to talk about education at paragraph 47, and you identify that disabled children lost the right to education when the schools closed. I just wondered, how can you tell me, is there a distinction, or is there a difference, or is there a greater impact on disabled children that can't go to school?
Not just disabled children, but potentially their parents might have been disabled as well, because you don't always have a family with just one disabled person in it. But many parents and carers faced added strain of children that were stressed because they didn't have their usual routines. They didn't have, and you know, they would. That would result in mental health issues for the child, and that would result in stress and strain for the parents and the rest of the family, the carers. They also didn't get support for that, home education, or even just looking after their child, and they didn't necessarily have the skills and tools that specialists in the education system might have had for helping them with that. So they struggled to find suitable online resources, which was made for the mainstream education, and to support the children's additional support for learning. There was also reports from respondents that, you know, that the anxiety could result in violent behaviour or self-harm, which would have been extremely difficult for parents and carers. Others observed the emergence of vocal tics, low mood. You know, at first there was no guidance of getting out, or potentially they couldn't go to crowded places because of a child's response to that. So they didn't have necessarily access to the outside spaces that everybody else had, and they certainly didn't have access to their usual places that they would go and, you know, either provide therapy or sport or health support.
Do you know, or do you have a view on how that could have been alleviated? Support just disappeared. So support, I think, would have been good. Potentially having, you know, schools offered some classroom-based support for the children of key workers. Potentially the additional support for learning in schools could have opened up an additional classroom for children with additional needs. Potentially those centres that closed down could have had a small number of children that they knew whose families were struggling. And communications would have been massively important with the families, which we're not convinced happened for all those families. You go on to talk about paragraph 51 and 52, the difficulties that disabled people had in accessing food and medicines, and you tell us that lack of internet access and supermarkets not making allowances for disabled people having to queue and so forth was an issue. How was that overcome?
How was that overcome? I'm not sure. This was a massive barrier. We know that over half of respondents struggled to access food for themselves or those that they care for. And sometimes, and more than a quarter face difficulties in obtaining necessary medicines to maintain their health. The supermarkets, they had lists of people that already accessed online shopping, and if you weren't on those lists, because you usually did your shopping in person, you couldn't get on those lists. My parents were included in that in England, actually, my elderly parents. But also, you couldn't go out with a carer either. You'd either lost your social care support, or an unpaid carer might go shopping with you, and you'd experience potentially abuse for having somebody with you and for not, isolating or, sending one person shopping because they didn't know you were disabled. So there was lots and lots of issues. There was also some people on special diets for their health that couldn't get the specialist food that they needed. So that was a barrier as well. But what helped, there was some community and voluntary. There was a lot of volunteering going on at a community level, and we don't know to extent that they were kitted out to provide additional services for disabled people. We know they tried to help people that they considered to be vulnerable or at risk, but they wouldn't necessarily have known the specific needs of those people. So, yeah, it would have been better if there'd been more joint working with disabled people's organisations at a local level if possible. We know that Glasgow Disability Allowance got in touch with thousands of their members asking them what they needed, and they did their best to help them meet those needs, but that wasn't Scotland-wide.
And by joint working, I don't want to dwell on this topic, we've obviously got other things to, but by joint working, what do you mean? Joint working with supermarkets or joint working with the government?
With local authorities, with community groups, with supermarkets, it's that bit that I mentioned earlier of gathering expertise from people with lived experience that know what they need, and finding out what the population needs. And local authorities could have worked with disabled people's organisations to find out who was who had additional need for specialist food or for medicines, and worked with pharmacies, worked with food suppliers. There's many partnerships that could have happened.
Thank you. I know a semi-related note in terms of, you say at paragraph 65 that some disabled people were not on the shielding list despite having conditions that put them at risk. So again, a bit like the point you were making earlier in relation to people being in employment and not having the letter. What type of conditions, without naming any particular individuals, what type of conditions are you referring to? When we surveyed the 800 plus disabled people that responded, we didn't ask them to give their conditions. I actually don't know that. We know that disabled people would have a range of conditions and impairments that might put them at risk, and we know that we heard from them that they'd discussed this with the doctor, that they were at high risk of getting COVID and what plans that they could put in place, and the doctor maybe recommended that they shield, but they didn't get that letter, that official letter that others were getting saying that they could shield and could continue shielding. But we don't know impairments and conditions that. Okay. Yeah. And I think you've explained that not having that letter created employment difficulties, or were there any other consequences of not having that letter?
Well, social life as well, things opening up and people being expected to go to family or to help out or to disabled people can be relied upon, the expectations from wider society as well, the expectations that you could go to appointments or you could go to a busy centre if you are at risk. We know people are still at risk from contracting COVID and from getting long COVID. It would put, their health is such that it would put them at a real detriment and maybe risk their lives. And that if they were to come to something like this and it didn't have specific features to help prevent the contagion of COVID-19, they would be highly at risk. So, yeah.
At paragraph 70 and 71, you give us some quite graphic, two graphic examples. You say that at paragraph 70 that a disabled person or disabled people were being told they would not be ventilated if they contracted COVID. Who was saying that to disabled persons?
Medical professionals, Public Health Scotland, I think, and Health Improvement Scotland. GPs were sending out letters. People were finding letters through the post saying that, they'd had an anticipatory care plan done by their GP, and this is what it recommended, and that they were frail, so they wouldn't get, but with no consultation done with that person. So it was quite a shock for people to realise that they were maybe, if they had COVID and were admitted to hospital, they wouldn't be resuscitated. And they know, people who responded to the survey said, a small number of people, but they said they or someone they'd known had been asked to sign one of these anticipatory care plans. And there was a deaf man as well that contacted us to share his experience. He went into hospital with COVID-19. He was very, very, very ill. And when he came to, when he was brought round and woke up, he discovered a DNA CPR. And the reason given for that notice being on his bed, the medics said that they couldn't communicate with him because he was deaf, whereas no actual effort was made to communicate with him.
So the default position was a DNA CPR in the absence of...
It's shocking, yeah.
You then go on to discuss vaccines, and at paragraph 80, you tell us that Inclusion Scotland tried to influence the Scottish Government on vaccine access. What was it you're trying to influence, and what were your concerns?
We were very concerned around the prioritisation methods that were being brought in, and that it would be unclear which groups, so for example, people with learning disabilities who were at high risk but weren't necessarily prioritised because they weren't in an older age group or they didn't have specific conditions. And there was, people who were shielding, who weren't prioritised because they weren't in the age group. So we had really big concerns about that. And that was before the vaccinations were brought in. So it was during the planning stages. Our CEO met with the Deputy to the National Clinical Director of the Healthcare Quality Strategy for the Scottish Government and some general practitioners to discuss our concerns, but it remained unclear whether we influenced decisions around that. And information was sporadic and unclear, so it left uncertainty about who was considered most at risk at the time. We were involved later on in planning for the both the appointment system and the venues to make sure that they were accessible and that they met Equalities and Human Rights. So that was Equality and Human Rights Impact Assessment. So we talked about but they had already set up these centres, so there was an issue with the location of a lot of vaccine centres. And an example was a blind woman that I knew living in Edinburgh at the time was scheduled for a very early vaccination appointment at the airport vaccination centre. And due to lengthy and impractical public transport with no support for that person at the time, she had to take, it would have taken her over 2 hours getting up before 6 in the morning. So she had to take a taxi, which then came out of her pocket. She had to pay for taxis there. it's put her at a disadvantage.
And you go on to say at paragraph 100 that disabled persons using the Scottish Government helpline experienced more negative than positive experiences. What negative experiences are you talking about when you say at paragraph 100 that the helpline?
I'm just looking at the paragraph.
Sorry, yes, it's paragraph
100.
Oh. Yes, I think it's 100, is it? Yes. Yeah, over 3/4, 78% of respondents without a letter reported that they'd not used the Scottish Government helpline for additional support. Amongst those who did, negative experiences outweighed positive ones. I think you are talking about in the context of the letter, the shielding letter.
The shielding letter, yeah, that they went to support. So it wasn't necessarily about the appointment system for vaccinations, which we advised on as they were setting them up, but it was about the lack of official proof and not being able to get good quality advice and, you know, having negative experiences with accessing advice around that, because I think nobody really knew what to do about that.
I mean, in terms of that's individuals contacting the Scottish Government, but you do go on at paragraph 104 to say that Inclusion Scotland, your organisation, was contacting the Scottish Government, and I think you describe it as being one way. Yes, it was a bit one way, my apologies, a bit one way. Well, what do you mean by that?
We were doing our best to shout as loud as I could, and as I said, our previous CEO at the time was trying to influence lots of people, including key people like Jason Leach, and she talked to us in the senior management team about medical guidance that was being issued, shielding, vaccinations. I was at the meeting about vaccinations with the deputy to the chief medical officer and other GPs. But it felt like Scottish Government had gone into emergency mode. So even where it was people that we knew before, they'd gone into the COVID team, the response unit at the Scottish Government, we couldn't get to them because, you know, so many people needed that attention, so many organisations were needing that attention, and as a DPO acting as an umbrella group in a strategic sense, we weren't considered to be on the ground with a community as such. So there was funding made available for a lot of these community organisations. But when we tried to get that funding to do specific things like advice about working from home, or we couldn't get it. We had all sorts of plans that we couldn't get funding for. But we were really trying to have an impact sort of through that Article 11 of the United Nations UNCRPD, that we were included because we knew that disabled people would be disproportionately affected. Public Health Scotland set up an equalities group that I got in touch with to try and get ourselves represented on it, and they said, oh, we're not looking at disabled people, we're looking at other groups, including gypsy travellers. Now, I don't doubt that gypsy travellers face specific barriers and had issues during the pandemic. I would never pitch one equality group against another, but I could not see why the representation of disabled people wasn't included in that immediate response group. It didn't make sense.
Thank you. And moving on to paragraph 107, you mention the summer of 2020 when the CEO of Inclusion Scotland convinced the Scottish Government to change the wording on what's known as the clinical frailty score. Can you tell us what the clinical frailty score is?
It was a set of guidance being used by medical practitioners that I think started in England and that set out a score for how you would treat specific groups who had COVID-19, how you would both prioritise and also deprioritise. So if somebody was particularly frail, you wouldn't necessarily prioritise their treatment over somebody that had prior to that been fit and healthy, because they were harder to treat, because they were more likely to die anyway, because you couldn't do CPR on them if they had that instruction. And it was a real concern that lots of disabled people who could be otherwise fit and healthy but had impairments and were managing conditions that were put at high risk could have been included in some of those high-level frail scores that wouldn't be treated for the pandemic. So I know that she did her best with others to influence the wording on that frailty score, but I never got a copy directly or saw what she did. I just knew that she'd been in some way successful in doing that and influencing it.
I think I should interject there to say that we have actually heard evidence about the clinical frailty score from our doctor.
My apologies, Nolan.
Oh, months ago, months ago, and it wasn't you that led the evidence, but it is in fact a recognised clinical tool which doctors use for not only in COVID but no doubt in COVID as well. So we have evidence about it somewhere.
Thank you.
Mr. Boyd can find it somewhere in the evidence.
Thanks.
Just a few more questions. You tell us at paragraph 111 that you're not aware of any tailored guidance that's been provided to Inclusion Scotland. Do you mean tailored guidance for disabled persons?
Yes.
And was that guidance, are you talking about guidance from Scottish Government, local authorities, or is it a range of?
Yeah, this was about tailored guidance that we or disabled people, the communities that we serve, might have received, and we weren't aware of guidance tailored to disabled people's needs from the evidence we gathered, either through specific, what to do if you lose social care support, what you do if you can't get to the shops, specific instances, or general guidance that wasn't translated. But that tailored guidance, as far as we were aware, didn't exist.
And in terms of tailored guidance, if it did exist, would you expect that to come from the Scottish Government, local authorities, third parties, or a combination of?
A combination, yeah.
Right.
And the various official sources of guidance, yeah.
Thank you. I don't have any more questions, but just before I do, I wonder if there's anything that we haven't covered that you would like to say, or if there's anything that's arisen that you thought, I wish I'd mentioned that in my statement before I thank you for your time today.
Without seeing the full statement in front of me, I can't think of anything.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Mrs. Nolan. Thank you, Dr. Nolan, for your evidence.
Thank you.
Grateful. Very good. That's lunch. We'll come back at 1:30. Yes, 1:30. Thank you.